So Chris, you have, I mean, when you showed us the workflow patterns, that is, I mean, I think pretty much also the direction this working group would like to go. Have you, I mean, you must have analyzed target applications, right, to come up with these workflow patterns already?
So Scott's team, and I'm going to call out Tom Beck, who's got his back to me, who's trying to hide, has been working with Tom's scientific computing group, and been working. So the folks who he has a quantum integration group that meets to talk about the various scientific applications that we're looking at from a facility perspective. And so these are some of the workflow patterns that have been extracted from that conversation, that Scott and myself in engaging with our scientific computing counterparts. However, I would say that the predominant view so far has been out of the QCUP program, which are NISC dominance, they're pure NISC systems, right? And so what I don't think we've started scratching at yet is how the workflow patterns change as we move towards fault-tolerant computing. Some of the algorithms that are of interest in the conversations we're having with them become much more challenging. Things like VQE, as we move towards more qubits and we move towards logical encodings.
And okay, please.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question there. What is more complicated about the near-term applications when you start to look at logical encodings? Where's the complexity or complication there?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time.
Sorry, you mentioned that it's becoming more complex when you take a look at variational type algorithms and logical encodings, and I'm trying to understand where the complexity.
Well, sampling rates becomes much more challenging. So as you utilize logical encodings, your ability to rapidly sample the machine becomes much more. The timing, right? So if you look at, talking to some of our trapped ion folks, looking at a million operations in a 20-to-1 logical encoding, we're saying is going to take minutes per shot, right? Or and that's with some hopeful optimization. Some of these might take hours, right? So high rate sampling becomes infeasible at that state.
Okay, so the challenge really is just that you have to wait longer.
Right. Well, and then, and some of the approaches as well. And this is not my domain, but if you, talking to some of our application developers, some of the approaches also go away. For instance, with VQE, there's limitations such as barren plateaus. Again, not my area of expertise, which makes some of the ways we're utilizing the systems now unable to be utilized in the future as the problem scales grow.
And many of the VQE applications that have been working reasonably well depend on having a pretty fine-grained degree of arbitrary rotations. And that is harder to achieve in a fault-tolerant system.
Rotations in logical encodings is a significant challenge, and most of the folks are focused on very small rotations, and larger encodings or larger rotations are still a problem to be solved.
Yep. Thank you.
A lot of the work is being directed at quantum simulations of materials where you have nuclei and electrons moving around. If you really want to do a quantum simulation, you want to evolve the system in real time. So you solve the electronic state for one configuration. You want to compute forces on the nuclei and then move them. So the cycle times really matter if you want to do hundreds of thousands of time integration steps. So I think the frequency and the time will matter in the end.
Yeah, so I understand that. It's just since I'm kind of poking at the provocative statements here and playing devil's advocate, right? So all I'm hearing is that from an implementation or an architecture standpoint, we just need to wait longer.
Yeah, but in this simulation, I'm imagining that the wait might be
Yeah,
unbearably
fair
long.
that it is. It may be unreasonably long, but you know,
Well, we also have practical considerations from a facility perspective. Waiting longer is just not so easy. Our scientific instrument over there at any given point in time has 60 to 70 different applications running on it. A leadership capability is generally defined as 20% of the system. I can't just tie up that resource waiting a day for a result to come back. I can't tie it up for 10 minutes. If it's not doing something important for 10 minutes, I'm better off preempting that application and putting it somewhere else for the result to come back. And so figuring out the operational models between scientific computing and quantum computing, where we are not wasting resources on either side, is very important. It's also very important not to waste qubits. They're very expensive right now. And so we also don't want to tie up the quantum computer waiting for the HPC resources. And so if an answer comes back and the application's not ready to operate on it, clearly we can store it, but we just need to figure out what the workflows look like.
I understand. Yeah, I think there's a difference here between prioritization, so that you know that you're working on an important application when you are utilizing the machine, and then load balancing.
Right.
Right. So one is, okay, it's a limited resource and we're only able to perform a handful of experiments per year. So then we have to prioritize what science needs to be done. And then, of course, yes, as these experiments are being done, we need to load balance to make sure that that limited resource is not sitting idle.
And if I could ask an analogous question, just usurping my role as moderator and moderating myself here, it's a serious question. What do we really mean when we say closely coupled? Is it a qualitative thing or is it simply a quantitative thing? Because to me, I tend to think of, closely coupled as, I am so damned old that I tend to think of closely coupled as sharing the same physical address space for storage. But there's other people who will take it somewhat differently. And so in this case, and this is not just a question to you to put you on the spot, but people to think about when we talk about closely coupled, what does that actually mean? Because in any case, it's going to be mediated by communication. So is it just a arbitrary level of latency that we're going to declare, or is it other assumptions that one party is making about the other in terms that they must necessarily both be up, et cetera? Do you have any response there? And if anybody else wants to weigh in, I think it's interesting.
All right, I'm going to start this with the traditional computer science answer, where it starts with "it depends," and it does. It depends on the geographical locations between the facilities, right? And so, are we talking about iterative cycles where we're waiting long periods of time to iterate between the compute? That becomes more problematic, and maybe we're also talking about data volume. So one of the things we need to be careful here is it's not just latency. Data volume becomes a problem. And data volume is the harder problem to solve. I can generate petabytes per second of data volume within Frontier, but coming into Frontier, I have a paltry 2 ESNet lines of 400 gigabit per second, right? So if I have a high volume data problem that I need close to that quantum computer, then frankly, the best way of doing that is put that HPC portion for that data volume next to that quantum computer, where I can utilize, things like the 800 gigabit or 1.6 terabit per second networking technology that we're seeing today, and I can widen that to be able to satisfy the requirements of data interaction between the quantum computer and the HPC. So it's not just latency. There's bandwidth that plays a role as well. And I don't think I have a good answer yet on what the data volume requirements are, because I don't know necessarily what the interactivity models are yet. So for instance, I was just talking, Travis and I have talked about, on a fault tolerant computer, I might want to do some NISQ work to start with, right? To pre-start or warm up a more fault tolerant circuit to preset it. Well, that interactivity may have a higher data volume or an interactivity loop that requires more bandwidth than what I'm going to get to something like Frontier. I don't, so this is what we need to figure out. So it's kind of like we need to identify the application use cases, the workflow patterns, and then once we start to identify where the bottlenecks are, we can identify the canary in the coal mine and start fixing those problems.
And I would just add, I completely agreed, and I would just add to that, there is some notion, not just of latency and bandwidth, but in terms of assumed knowledge across the system. If I'm running an MPI application on Frontier, I am making assumptions that I'm going to be able to communicate with other nodes and the communicators with some degree of reliability. I'm not going to be asking on each iteration, are you okay? And it's when we start getting to a more loosely coupled scheme, you can make fewer assumptions about availability and uptime, and you have to, and this gets reflected in the codes, and that's what I'm trying to get to. We're building a framework where people are going to be building hybrid applications. And so just, what degree of knowledge is reasonable to assume, to me, is an important question for everyone here.
I just wanted to add one thing, Kevin, which is that, as Chris mentioned, maybe before you go to full fault tolerant, or even on a fully fault tolerant computer, you still want to probably do some NISQ work. But there is also an intermediate solution which goes by the name of partial FTQC, where you do a subset of your operations in a fault tolerant way. And the most expensive one, which is the low angle rotation gates, which require magic state synthesis, etc., you do them in a post selection based way. And there is a very interesting trade-off that happens, which is that for most of the applications we have looked at today, including material science and quantum chemistry simulation, the lowest required physical qubit counts come from partial FTQC. Okay, because you're able to trade off a lot of the magic state factories that you would need to be constantly running. But there is a trade-off, right? It doesn't come for free. There's no free lunch theorem, right? And so what that means is that you spend time doing post selection, but then and that's okay. That's perfectly fine, especially right now as we struggle to scale qubits up. Right. So not only do we want this NISQ versus FTQC discussion, I think there needs to maybe even be a partial FTQC discussion.
No, I think that's superb. And I think that feeds into one of the things that I think is an objective for this team is at some point we have to come up with an agreed upon structure and description of the resources to be used. And this strongly suggests that there's a nuance. This is not just about I need a certain number of qubits, but I need a certain number of qubits. They may be fault tolerant or not. That's a binary, status. But then there can also be, shades of gray in there that we're
Yes.
going to have to agree upon what is reasonable in a description.
100%. Maybe one more comment while I have the mic. I think I really like the question you asked before, which is that do we agree as a community on what co-location and tight coupling actually means? Can we put some numbers down in terms of timescales, distances, compute, throughput? And I think that will take this conversation much farther than everyone has their own interpretation of what that means. And we are fighting while we just don't agree on the definition. Right. So I think quantifying some of these terms will probably make this discussion much more useful.
And again, I always prefer qualification to quantification because it tends to be a little bit more easy to reason about formally. So yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Paul, you had a comment?